today's event. My name is Lan Peijia. I'm the director of Global Asia Research Center, also known as GARD. GARD was established just last year, thanks to a generous donation from Ching Foundation in South Korea. The foundation is in honor of the memory of Ching, the famous leader of the Korean independence movement against Japanese colonization. You can find out more about his biography in the exhibition outside. So with this gift, we are able to establish Ching visiting professorship at National Taiwan University. Each year, we invite at least one distinguished international scholar who has contributed excellent scholarship to Asian studies. Today, we are honored to introduce our very first Ching visiting professor, Dr. Ching Li. During her visit at NTU, she is teaching a mini course on comparative and global ethnography. There are still 2 lectures coming. If you are interested, you are all welcome to join. And she will also have close interaction with NTU faculty members. Dr. Li is a professor of sociology at UCLA and previously taught at the University of Michigan. She has produced 3 brilliant monographs on China, forming a trilogy of Chinese capitalism through the lens of labor and working class experiences. The first one is Gender and the South China Miracle, 2 Words of Factory Women. This book documents the organization of gender and work in factory regime in Hong Kong and Shenzhen, when South China first emerged as a workshop of the world. The second book, Against the Law, Labor Protests in China's Rust Belt and Sun Belt, published in 2007, chronicles the unmaking and making of the Chinese working class into regional economies, experiencing the death of socialism and the rise of capitalism in the same country. So today we'll hear about her most recent book. Here I have the copy. The Specter of Global China, Politics, Labor, and Foreign Investment, which was just published last year. So in which follows the footsteps of Chinese investors to Zambia. The book has won several awards, including 3 Best Book Awards given by ASA, American Sociological Association, including a section of Asia and Asian American labor and labor movements and sociology development. So please join me to welcome Dr. Li.
Thank you very much, Peijia, for inviting me. It is my distinct honor to visit this prestigious university in Taiwan. And of course, I'm very, very happy to see her again. I've known her and her work for many years and have been a great admirer of her work. And also, I'm happy to see some very old friends, good friends, and as well as meeting new ones. And I'm particularly happy in the past days to have the opportunity to interact with some very talented students on this campus. And I've been enjoying the seminar on global and comparative ethnography very much, and I look forward to more discussions in the days to come. So I'd like to talk to you about my most recent book. It's a topic that is not just relevant to people in Africa, because China has arrived in Africa, but I think it's also very relevant to people in Asia, in Taiwan. My friend Wu Denli had talked about the China factor in Taiwan. Hong Kong, where I was born, also is facing different kinds of presences of Chinese government and capital. So the China factor is very active there. So what I like to point out is that what I have found in Zambia, which is one very small country actually in terms of population, may have relevance for us to think about global China as a phenomenon around the world, and maybe could lead to some comparative research in the future, especially among the young students here. We need your energy to go around the world to document and compare the different ways and different reactions that global China has generated. So, the Specter of global China. I think we will have to begin with this guy. He's the one who has done more than anybody else to spread, to raise this specter of global China around the world. And his signature project, of course, is the One Belt, One Road that people talk about on a daily basis because of the large amount of resources that is being spread around because of this project. I mean, in terms of scale, this is just mind-boggling. It will be 10 times larger than the US National Plan if it is realized. And this is a big if, and you'll begin to understand if you stay through the talk today. But anyway, this kind of global presence has triggered a very prominent discourse to understand this phenomenon. And this is the discourse of neocolonialism. Here, you see Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State from the US visiting Zambia, where I spent quite a bit of time doing the research. And when she arrived, basically she was making this remark about the Chinese presence, referring to it as another instance of neocolonialism. And she's saying that, well, the West and Africa don't want another round of colonialism. So she made this remark about China in Africa as a case of neocolonialism. And she's not alone. Politicians who want to score political points use this, invoke this rhetoric of colonialism. But sometimes you see academics, in this case Howard French, who used to be the Beijing correspondent for the New York Times and now a professor of journalism in Columbia University. He published this book and basically invoking again this idea of empire building. And his evidence is the million of Chinese migrants arriving in Africa. Now you can question whether that really is the case. If you have 1 million migrants, ordinary people migrating, does it constitute an empire? But that's just his title. That word is in his title. And so you can see that, to sell books maybe, because invoking empire building is scary. The Specter of global China can sell books, and so if you want your book to bring a lot of income, you want to use this. So colonialism is the term we hear a lot, and in response to that, China says, well, we're not doing colonialism, we're doing self-development. We're helping our southern brothers to develop. That's why we invest so much, that's why we pour so much resources, and so many people go there. The beginning of this study is to find an alternative frame to understand this phenomenon, global China. It's definitely happening, but I don't think colonialism is the most productive framework to think about this phenomenon. And the reason is the following, and I want to disabuse you of this notion before I tell you what an alternative framework I have used for this study. The reason I want to spend several minutes on this is because this is the most prevalent, and I'm sure coming to this room knowing I'm going to talk about China in Africa, this is also the kind of theoretical framing that you come with. And so I want to just say right from the beginning that I don't think this is the most productive, most appropriate frame to think about this phenomenon. And the reason is, I think colonialism is more a rhetoric than something that can reflect reality on the ground. And the reason is, if you look at what China has been doing up to now in Africa, you would realize that some of the key features of colonialism hasn't happened in this case with regard to China in Africa. For instance, military occupation, chartered companies with exclusive trading rights, proselytizing of religion. These are very characteristic features of historical colonialism. And we haven't found that Maybe it will happen in the future, but so far, if we're thinking in terms of reality, these haven't happened. And then some people will say, okay, well, formal colonialism hasn't happened. What about informal colonialism, informal empire, in which case we're talking about influence, China establishing influence, achieving influence in Africa. Again, it will be very difficult for anyone to come up with concrete evidence establishing China's influence in Africa. Like what kind of decisions have African countries made that were due to Chinese influence? Another reason why people think of China as colonial is because of the large amount of investment that it has poured to this continent. And if you look at statistics like I have presented in the book, you'll find, and I was quite surprised actually, to find that actually China is not the leading investor in Africa. It ranks number 6 in terms of FDI in Africa, and it is falling behind France, US, UK. These are the kind of traditional Western powers, as well as falling behind Malaysia and South Africa by both accumulated stock up to 2015. That's the last figure that I found. And it's only 4th by flow, that is year-to-year flow. So if you point to the amount of investment that China has made in Africa and say this is colonial, then we might as well use colonial to describe all these countries, which makes the word lose any particular significance or meaning. And another reason why I think colonialism is not the right way to think about this phenomenon is because colonialism usually is a geopolitical formation that takes a long time for it to form, decades if not centuries. And I think what we have been seeing, the reality, empirical reality, is that China has only been in Africa for 15 years at most, this new wave of investment. Of course, you could always trace China's presence of aid in various forms to Africa since the 1960s, 1950s, the Bandung Conference being the official beginning of that. But the latest round hasn't happened 20 years ago. It was only since the late 1990s. So I think invoking colonialism serves many purposes by various people. But for us academics, we should think very carefully before using that as a framework to analyze reality. So there are many more reasons that I mentioned in the book as to why it is not productive. Because colonialism, if you use colonialism, you are glossing over many of the new ways of power that China is practicing. Because colonialism makes us think that, well, China is repeating what the West has done. And that word leads you away from asking new questions about China's own way of power, China's own stagecraft. You use an old word to describe a new reality, and that is not very productive. And also, another very important thing that you may want to consider is that using describing Chinese activity as colonialism may only apply to China's ambition. I may even concede that China has colonial ambition in the sense of dominating politically, economically, culturally Africa. But ambition is very different from achievement. I want to be rich doesn't mean I'm rich. When people talk about Chinese presence in Africa, most of the time, if you read carefully, they're actually talking about China's ambition, and then slide into this other argument about Chinese achievement. So what I want you to start separating is this idea of ambitions as opposed to achievement, and then come to your own conclusion as to what China is doing. I think at the end of the day, we may need to find another concept, create another notion to describe what China is doing. But for this, I'm not in this book. I actually have asked another question about China's presence in Africa. I started with conflating ambitions with achievement. I started with what has happened, which is that China has poured a lot of investment in the continent. So Chinese capital is what I was interested in. And the question I was asking when I started this project was, is Chinese capital a different kind of capital? Capital, since the day of Karl Marx, people have always talked about capital, have theorized about capital, but if you think carefully, I think most accounts of capital just assume that there is one type of capital. There's no theories about varieties of capital. And I think what China may be doing, and that is new, and that is theoretically, historically, politically significant, is that China maybe is the source of a very different kind of capital, and that is state capital. Because if you look at statistics, a lot of companies that are now active in Africa are state-owned companies, and not just state-owned companies, they are centrally state-owned companies, which means that these companies are charged with the goal of realizing state-defined interest. That set it apart from the ordinary kind of capital that Marx has talked about, and all the Marxists since Marx have talked about, which is a kind of capital with what interest? With the interest of profit accumulation. In contemporary language, we talk about capital that wants to maximize shareholder values. That's private capital, global capital, but the goal is always profit maximizing. So for this particular study, because of the prevalence of Chinese state capital in Africa as around the world, my question is this a different kind of capital? Because this is all I could see in Africa is the various projects and investment projects. And so the theoretical question for me is China, now that it has gone abroad, is it introducing a different kind of capital into our modern global capitalism? And if so, if it is, then maybe this is why we should pay attention to, because it is something that is really different. So the question then that has gone through the whole book is about whether Chinese state capital is different from global private capital. That's the theoretical question, not about colonialism. Well, I don't want to go too much into explaining what capital is, but to me it is not something that we can capture by statistics, which a lot of people studying China in Africa or Latin America resort to, looking at statistics of investment and trade. I don't think capital is quantifiable. Well, it is quantifiable, but the essence of capital is not quantifiable. You have $1,000, you put it under your pillow. Does that make you a capitalist, or that $1,000 is capital? No. Right? This is in capital, Marx capital. You have to put it into circulation to let it acquire value, valorization. That makes it capital. Otherwise, it's just money. So that means for this study, I need to compare how these two types of capital relate to government, relate to labor. It's a set of contested relationship that I need to study. And I try to construct 3 dimensions of capital out of classical sociology. From Marx, the first dimension, the first moment of capital is accumulation. What does it want to accumulate? And this is the first part of my book and the first part of my talk today. The second, once you know what you want to accumulate, capital needs a system of production to realize its interest. So I need to talk about how it relates to labor, the regime of production. And the third, from Weber, capital doesn't just flow into a country. Capital needs foot soldiers. These are people, human beings, who have to have motivations in order to realize the interest of capital. So I need to look at the managers who were sent to Africa and the kind of ethos that motivate. What's their agency? And this is a Weberian question. And actually, Polanyi is underlying all the analysis I have. But the 3 moments are these 3. And what I did in this book was to compare the 2 types of capital Chinese state capital versus global private capital. That's the first dimension, the two types, of course. But I also have two sectors, copper and construction, copper mining as opposed to construction. And these are chosen for theoretical reason. In my class, I talk to students about the importance of constituting theoretical cases. Copper is very different from construction, but these two sectors are the major sectors where Chinese state capital and global private capital have invested in Africa, in this case, Zambia. Copper is different from construction in the sense that copper is based on very organized labor. It's the most organized labor in any country because mines don't go away. You go to the mines. Mines are place-based industries, and therefore workers are also very embedded in the local society, and therefore they're mostly very organized and they have solidarity. Whereas construction is based on the most informalized, the least unionized, the least organized, the weakest kind of power of workers because they are temporary workers. So you see the comparison is trying to look at capital between these two types, but also trying to vary the kind of class balance of power between these sectors to see whether these two types of capital will have different behavior. I did spend some time, 07 to 14, in Zambia, doing ethnography, meaning that I actually go down the mines a lot to see and to observe miners and management's relationship. It's relational processes I want to study. I also went to many construction sites and observed hung out there. And I also studied the state, Zambian state, how these different kinds of capital relate to Zambian officials. And actually have many, many fascinating stories. It revealed the two types of capital, how they differ in terms of state capital relation, state labor relation. But anyway, studying up and down, and because I had to study politicians as well, I had to study government and going down the mines. One thing very important for people doing ethnography is to historicize our ethnography. That is, we have to theorize the conditions when we did the ethnography. The time period here was absolutely significant to my theoretical argument, in the sense that during this period, things happened, and I theorized those events into my argument about the nature of these two types of capital. And the important thing that happened during this period was resource nationalism, that is people, Zambian people, Africans in general, at this moment, were very angry about foreign investors. Their mines have been privatized. The World Bank have made them privatize their mines, they're all state-owned assets because of structural adjustment. The mines were privatized and owned by foreigners, and Zambians remained very poor. So around that time, in this period, resource nationalism, there is a lot of bottom-up political pressure on the Zambian elite to do something about foreign investment. This is a very important factor that I was able to observe. So I theorized what happened to these capital when there is a lot of political backlash to their presence. Another important thing, 2007 to 2007 to 14, remember the financial crisis? When the financial crisis hit during my research, I was able to observe how these two different types of capital reacted to the same financial crisis. And so these are also very important considerations that I incorporated into my analysis to look at the different types of capital, which means the point here is that capital is not fixed in their interest and in their behavior. They vary with political pressure and economic challenges. And my job is to see how these affect them. For people who, like me, when I started this project, had no idea where Zambia was. It's in the middle of southern part of Africa. I spent a lot of time in the border region with DRC, and this is a world-class copper deposit. Lusaka is here, that's the capital, and around the country I had to travel for the construction sector, but for the mining sector I stay here, studying the government. A lot of times I hang out with the elite of the government in the capital. So I want to give you the summary of the argument and then go to the 3 moments to explain to you the differences between these two types, and particularly highlighting what is special about Chinese state capital, why I think it is a different variety of capital. But the nutshell of my argument is this. Beijing, as I said earlier, Beijing's ambition to be dominant, to be colonial, let's say, does not determine its achievement. Doesn't mean it has achieved domination. So when you hear reports, again, in the leading media, which you find a lot, saying that, oh, China has invested tens of billions of dollars in this country and they're building the Belt and Road and all these projects, the assumption underlying those reports is always the Chinese ambition is its achievement. And therefore people are really scared about China's presence. But if you separate that out and look at the ground, what's on the ground, what has happened on the ground, you will realize that what China can achieve indeed has to do with what Beijing's interests are. Yes, there's no undeniable that what China wants, it will try to realize. So we have to look at China's interest. But their interests do not determine what they can achieve because of many, many local pressures and reactions that they have to take into account. And once you include this local political synergy, particular synergy means between state elite and ordinary people, in my case it's labor, then you will realize Beijing has to change not its interests, but its behavior in order to achieve those interests. And it is in the actual behavior that we should be looking at in order to understand the real effect of China in Africa. Not how much money is spent or what it wants, but if it wants to achieve something, what it has to do in response to all these local pressures to realize its interest. And oftentimes you will see something quite surprising. In my study in mining, remember I compare mining and construction? In mining, what I find is that against our common sense, that because it is state capital, it is more powerful, it is more dominant, wrong. In mining, Chinese state capital is actually subjected to more local political class, that is labor, and cultural contestations than global private capital. That means in Zambia, Chinese state capital in mining is actually under attack most of the time by government and to make it more negotiable. That is, the Chinese mine has to give in, make concessions more than the global private mines. More negotiable, and as a result, Chinese state capital has done more to make more concession to the Zambian elite to give Zambian elite what it wants. And I'll explain what it wants and what action it has given. But in construction, it's quite the opposite. Chinese state capital turned out to be more perilous. That is, compared to global private capital in construction, Chinese state capital is more destructive rather than developmental to Zambia's interest. Chinese state capital brings more perilous consequences to African development. So these are the two very, I would say, counterintuitive findings. First, in some sector, Chinese state capital is actually more concessionary, more negotiable than your London-listed global capital, global company. Second, it doesn't mean, therefore, that Chinese state capital is always a positive force for Africa, because in construction, you'll see that Chinese state capital is actually more destructive. It brings more problems to Africa, and I'll explain what more problems. But basically, these are the two conclusions. Okay, I need to skip about Zambia. So let's go first to the first dimension of capital. Accumulation. What do these two types of capital want to achieve? Now, profit maximization, of course, is the goal of global capital. Now, in this case, in my study, global capital is represented by two London Stock Exchange listed mines. These are really giants in the majors. They call it majors in the mining sector. They're listed in London. I compare those two with the Chinese state-owned, centrally state-owned mines in Zambia, copper. So profit maximization is the interest. Global capital is one-dimensional profit. They only consider, they want to realize one kind of profit. Their profit maximization and is financial profit. For the Chinese, now this is interesting. The Chinese, what does the Chinese state capital want to achieve? Well, they entertain several different forms of profit. Making money, yes, but it doesn't have to maximize financial profit. It has to make some profit. It can't operate in the red and stay and expect stay handout. But it also wants to accumulate political capital, political influence, and it also wants to access copper at source, not going through the copper market. Want to have the mines for 99 years so that when China needs copper and the market doesn't give copper to China, it can go to these mines and just get the ore. Now, you may think, when I stop here, you say, hey, this is colonialism. Colonialism means you want more than, you want political influence, you want the ores, profit is okay, but not necessarily important. Again, yes, the goals may be colonial, but what does China have to do in order to achieve this? This is the more important question. Okay, the copper for these global guys is really for the exchange value because it brings profit. But for the Chinese, well, this is very important. It affects all the rest of the story. For the Chinese, copper is important because they can sell for money, but also the ore itself. The use value of copper is important to Chinese state, and that's why even when copper prices may go down a lot, the Chinese mine will stay because their objective is not only to make profit, they want the ore. And all this calculation, these interests, lead to very different behavior when relating to the Zambian government, especially during the financial crisis. In the financial crisis, when the crisis hit, these global companies immediately reacted by retrenching labor, laying off a total of 1/3 of the mining workforce, and it was an earthquake for a country that was totally dependent on copper. Miners earn the highest salaries among the working class in Zambia because it is the most lucrative sector. And usually one miner has to support not just his or her own, usually his biological dependence, but also just a whole bunch of dependents because people die young. Average age life expectation is only 47 years old, so you have you have to take care of the kids of your brothers and cousins. And so it was a big hit, a crisis for many Zambians because these companies began retrenching. Guess what the Chinese did? Remember, its goal is to accumulate political capital, to buy the goodwill of the Zambian elite, to influence, therefore, hopefully, the diplomacy. And also, it wants to establish itself, the legitimacy of the mine in Zambia, to influence society, and also it wants copper. It doesn't want to stop production of copper. So the Chinese, during that same period, it was very stark difference. came out and say, we have a 3 no's policy. No retrenchment, no reduction in salary, no reduction in production. It was very stable. And the reason was because it has goals more than financial goals. And there are a number of examples during that period I can point to suggest that they related to the Zambian state in a very different way, very concessionary and negotiable, trying to work with the Zambian elite so that they can survive this crisis. And the reason why they're so concessional and accommodating, because of their goal of building their political presence. The most important example showing this is when the Zambian government talked to these foreign investors and say, hey, you have money, help us to turn copper ore into copper products so that we can sell, we can value add to develop our economy. These London-listed companies say, no, we're not going to help you. We're not going to invest in copper manufacturing because it's not profitable. Guess what the Chinese did? Well, the Chinese built them, agreed to help them, and built them this special economic zone because the Zambian elite actually pushed them, talk to them, argue with them, and say you need to do this, this is for the good of the country, and the Chinese agreed. At the request, the demands of the Zambian elite, the Zambians have always thought about value addition. They have plans and laws well in place before the Chinese even arrived. So in the mining situation, the Zambian elite had to develop a strategy. They have long thought about the strategy. And they talked to the Chinese. And you can see this is the zone. It is the first Chinese built and run zone in Africa. Now there are many, some are private, some are state, but this one is the first one. It may not look very nice to you, but in Africa this is really nice. See the roads and the power, and then that's a state-of-the-art smelter, very high tech. So for the mining situation, the mining case, it suggests that China was more negotiable. The Chinese state mine was more accommodating to Zambian elite's demand than the global private companies, and it reacted to financial crisis in a very different way than global private capital. It looks like, well, the Chinese state capital is more benign. It's a more benign kind of capital. It helped Zambia, it responded to Zambian demand for development. It was the case in mining. But when you turn to construction, you'll see a very different phase of Chinese state capital in construction, because workers are weak, they're not organized, as I said, they were informalized, two years in one place, and then they're disbanded. And usually construction has been the most informalized sector around the world anyway. So no labor pressure, labor was too weak to force concession, and Zambian elite has no development strategy for construction. In mining, they always know our country is dependent on copper. How do we develop copper to make our country develop? In construction, they have no such strategy. They don't know what to do with Chinese investment in construction. All that they can talk to me about was the elite. Even the vice president talked to me, say, more is better. In the head, more construction project is better because why? I said, why? They said, well, the Chinese may leave one day, but they can't bring the bridges and roads with them, can't they? That's why they think, oh, more is better. But is it more is better? No, because in construction, Chinese state capital comes in the form of concessional loans. And these loans, they distribute these loans in trying to build patronage relations. So this elite, this particular political leader come to the Chinese state bank. The state bank gave them a loan, and this elite will be beholden, this politician will be beholden to China. And why these political elites want construction projects? Because they want to win the next election. There's a village, you build a road through this village, you get the votes. Whether that road is going to generate development in the long run, they don't care, because who cares 20 years later when you have to repay these loans? This guy is already long gone. But what he worries about is the next election cycle. So in this case, in the construction case, the difference is what? What's the difference between construction and mining? The difference is the lack of elite strategy and the lack of labor capacity to force concession from Chinese state capital. In this case, Chinese state capital in the form of concessional loans, but also in the form of contractors. These loans come with a very big condition, and that is who is going to be the contractor to use this loan to build a road. It has to be Chinese, not only Chinese company, but under the condition of no bidding. Now, if you have no bidding, what would happen is the price tag of these projects will be inflated because there's no bidding. So it's whoever set the price will be the amount of the loan. And it is in China's interest, to many of these Chinese companies' interest, these contractors, to maximize the price tag because it means the Chinese government will give it higher project price. But for Africa, this is a very dangerous situation. They just got themselves out of many, many years of debt to the World Bank. They were forgiven. And now China is becoming the major creditor to Africa, to Zambia. And you will see more recently, we are paying attention to news, different political national leaders from the global south are saying no to concessional loans from China, starting with Malaysia. I think last night I heard Maldives is another country that have expressed this concern. We're not going to borrow money anymore from China because this is emerging, this problem. And behind it, the whole thing has to do with the lack of political will, lack of development strategy, and the lack of any restraint from the bottom up by labor and voters. So I think the first thing you want to know is that state capital doesn't have one particular feature or characteristic. It depends on whether the local state, in this case the government of the country where it invests in, and the people, workers, voters in those countries know how to bargain with, know how to request and put pressure on the Chinese investors. So if they do, there's a developmental synergy between state and society. Then, which is the case in mining, you will see that state capital actually is a positive force for development because it goes beyond what global private capital would do to help development. But if in construction, if you do not know what you want, if you do not have a development strategy, then and the workers are too weak to force any concession, then you subject the country, you make a country very vulnerable to a particular kind of predation. So you have two phases of Chinese state capital. It could be more developmental than ordinary capital, or it can be more predatory than ordinary capital. And what is the variable that decides which phase you see? It is what happens in the place where China invests in, and that is the local synergy, political synergy between elite and workers. So I'm going to go relatively fast on the two other dimensions, but these two other dimensions you'll see are also related to the interest of capital. Now I'm still thinking of capital as mostly driven by interest. The difference between perhaps Marx's definition of capital is that interest, in my study as proven or demonstrated by these two cases, interest, the multiple interests that different kinds of capital want to realize. The interest of these two different kinds of capital drive different regimes of production and drive different ethos of management. Now, I don't have time to go through all these, but let me talk about how different the regimes of mining, how these two types of capital mine the mine differently and also treat workers differently. Remember I said the Chinese want the ores, copper ores, not just the profit coming from the ores? And so you will find that in the private capital case, inside the mine, I spent time as an ethnographer in the mines, in the offices of these companies, and you could hear what they argue about. And what they argue about means what they care most about. And you can tell them what these two types of companies are concerned about. And I just sum up here, the private companies, they are always concerned about finance. It's a very finance-oriented, finance-driven. Every decision, every argument is about how you cut costs. Whether it's cheaper, it's about cost. For the Chinese, they're production-oriented. That is, they care about the volume of ore that is being produced. They want smooth production. Cost, of course, is important. I heard them talk about it all the time. But the more important thing, the overarching thing, is really maintaining stable production, ensuring the tonnage and the quality, the copper quality of the ore. So they are less sensitive to short-term fluctuation of prices. In these two cases, the other two mines, any fluctuation in metal prices would generate a lot of discussion and reaction. The Chinese are less susceptible to that. In terms of exploration, I mean, we don't have time to get into technical details of mining. You can ask me in Q&A, but they actually do different kinds of exploration and different kinds of blasting. There are different issues of how far ahead they blast to prepare the mine. Again, too technical, don't have time to go into. But I want to highlight one thing, which is, this is too long, don't look at it, listen to me. Which is, because the Chinese state mine is so intent on maintaining tonnage, stable production, whereas these other guys are interested in finance, cost, cutting down cost, to show to the shareholders that they're doing it. One thing really distinguishes these two types of mines. Subcontracting, how they subcontract. Now, subcontracting is universal in the mining industry, anywhere you go, in the US, Canada, Australia. But for these global guys, when I went underground, every day I saw so many different colors of uniform because they subcontract like crazy. I can't even begin to count how many subcontractors they use for different work, different job underground. So I see a lot of uniforms. In the Chinese subcontracting situation, there's only one subcontractor. The reason is they want to maintain stable production. They don't want to spend time, because the more subcontractors you have, they fight more. Over equipment, it's harder to manage. But on the book, you're cutting costs by subcontracting. But the Chinese only have one subcontractor. So why did I mention this as a very important feature? Because it is extremely important. It has extremely important consequence for labor power, the capacity of labor to force the hand of management. Because if you only have one subcontractor, your workers are unified. Because you're dealing with one employer. If you have many, many subcontractors, your workforce is totally divided, and that's why more strikes happen in the Chinese state mine, and they have to make more concessions to their workers because they care so much about production and smooth production and tonnage. And so in this Chinese state mine case, you see stronger labor power that has to do with how they run the mine, and how they run the mine has to do with their interest. And so it is connected that labor is more powerful in the Chinese state mine, again, against our expectation that state capital is more powerful, exploitative, and everything else that you have heard about Chinese capital. Whereas in the global private mines, actually, workers' strike are shorter, less powerful, and as a result, companies made less concession. And they were fired more because they're responding. Companies are responding to fluctuation in copper prices. And when your company is listed in the London Stock Exchange, you have professionally, your first reaction to anything is to cut labor. Because this is what investors look for in managers. They react to cut costs, and what is the quickest way to bring the cost down is to cut labor. And so the labor politics in these two places are different, workers' power are different. And that is how I compare these two regimes of production. Some pictures of, okay. The third dimension is about managerial ethos. So this is a group of managers who hosted me. I stay with them, I live with them, mostly men, a few women, and I don't know what you notice about them. Anything that strikes you? Well, they're all dressed the same, which you don't find in these two other, the global private lines, where the expats came from mostly South Africa, India, Peru. Peru is a big mining country. So this is striking in the sense that they want to project a collective image. And collectivism is one big motif in this, what is very central to the culture. Lunchtime, everybody lined up for their food. Even the CEO eat from the same canteen, from the same food. We stay in what is called a China house. Every Chinese company would accommodate their employees in a compound. They rent a house or sometimes buy a house. But the local call it China house, and that tells you only Chinese investors would house their employees in the same place, like a dormitory for a kind of setting. And everybody will eat from the same kitchen. They will be provided with 3 meals at exactly the same time every day. If you miss that, you won't have food. And then you get bussed in and out. You don't drive your car, your own cars, whereas the Indians and the South Africans and the Peruvian engineers and the expats in other global private mines, they have their own cars, they have their own biological timetable. But the Chinese are all living together, not just together, they also emphasize saving. No enjoyment is asceticism for those who think about Weber. It is exactly as what Weber has said about the Protestant ethics, the moral compulsion to work hard, to be disciplined, to save. Except for Weber, it is practiced individually. In this case, it is collective, and not just collective, it is being enforced by headquarters. The company enforced this kind of collective asceticism. Party, the Communist Party, sent delegation to come to the mine while I was doing field work. One day, party delegation arrived from Beijing, and what did they do? They want to make sure these expats who were sent to this very remote part of Africa, make sure that they realize what Beijing, Xi Jinping just came to power, 2012, and they wanted to make sure that these managers knew what Beijing, the party line was, and be able to practice those party lines in the mines, in Zambian mines. So at that time, we were talking about anti-corruption, mass line. So they were interviewed individually. The senior manager, the guys in ties, they were interviewed individually and being asked, how are you going to realize this mass line in this mine? And so it is very much monitored and controlled and policed by the party state. The Chinese always describe their ability to withstand discipline, to live in a very frugal way as eating bitterness, as it is a Chinese trait, cultural characteristic. And one thing that really, really illustrates their asceticism is the absence of family life. Only the Chinese do not bring their families to work in Zambia. South Africans, Indians, Peruvians, they work in Zambia, but they bring their wives and children. The Chinese are the only one that live there without family. And this has come under serious cultural criticism by Africans. They say that these are all convicts, prison labor sent by the Chinese government, because only Chinese prisoners would have no choice but live this kind of life. And so, the Chinese way of life is being singled out and demonized as extremely abnormal, inhuman. So think about that. It is not, if China is colonial, well, it has failed very miserably because even its way of life is being singled out and criticized as undesirable, as inhuman. I want to argue, actually, in the book, that this is a particular way of class exploitation. The government promotes this idea eating business is a Chinese character personality. So these managers, in the face of criticism, say that, hey, eating business is who we are. It is morally superior for Chinese to be able to eat business, whereas other expats and local workers do not know how to eat business. And this sense of moral superiority actually conceal class exploitation from the managers themselves. These managers see it is good that we can eat business. We are better than all these other guys, other nationalities, because we can eat business. But because they subscribe, because they believe that eating business is a moral superiority, they actually don't see that they are more exploited by Chinese state capital. So Chinese state capital is actually more controlling, more exploitative, not of its own workers, but they are more concessionary to the local ones if the local ones know how to bargain with them. So to sum up, really summing up, I have remembered my question. The driving question of this study is what is peculiar about Chinese state capital, and I said because it wants to pursue state-defined interest, and that leads to these three differences. That is, in terms of what its goal, in terms of its organization of production, in terms of the ethos of management. So these are all empirical differences. And state capital. Now, state capital, in this case, is from China, but state capital comes from many countries. China is the only country in Africa that has substantial state capital. But what I want to do in this study, and what I try to inspire other people to do, is to continue studying state capital as a form of capital that may not come from China, let's say from France, from even Taiwan, if not today, then previously, Malaysia, India, Saudi Arabia, Norway. If you begin to think, actually many states have state capital. And if Chinese state capital, as this case illustrates, has different logic and that different consequences, then I think it would help us to understand and be able to exploit that difference better if we have a theory of state capital. And to build that theory, this is not going to do it. It's not enough. We need more comparative study of state capital itself. Here, I have only established the plausible differences between state capital and private capital. To really build a theory of state capital as an alternative kind of capital, we need more empirical studies of state capital from France, from Chile, for instance. Compare that maybe with China or India or whatever cases that you find relevant. But what I like to say here is that in today's neoliberal capitalist world, we may want to see and think of varieties of capital. There's a big literature on varieties of capitalism, which I think is not, I just don't think it's correct, because capitalism is one, it's global, that's it. But within this global capitalism, we may have varieties of capital. And if it is true that it behaves differently, then we might as well find ways to react to it in a way that is different from how we react to or try to subordinate global private capital. And just the final slide, going back to One Belt, One Road. As I said, state capital, the character of state capital actually is not fixed, it's not set in stone, it depends on reactions. And Chinese state capital is not always dominant. And if you look at existing reports about Belt and Road, you will realize this project is running into lots and lots of problems. And it has increasing problems by the day. Political risk, financial risk, social risk, and you will see all these cases of protest. Sri Lanka is one of the earliest to put up a very important, powerful, popular protest against Chinese investment in a big port, really huge port area. But this is the Financial Times report that surveys multiple projects along the Belt and Road, and what it found is astonishing. But it agrees with my conclusion, which is that there has been a lot of popular resistance and pushback on Chinese state capital. This report finds that the value of abandoned Chinese rail projects is double the value of projects that are still ongoing. So when you hear reports about Chinese investment and the assumption of Chinese dominance that comes with it, you have to think twice, because nobody tells you, nobody followed through how these projects have unfolded, and many of them have failed. So if many of them have failed, that means China is not exercising any dominant faith. China is failing in its own so-called colonial ambition. So this is something that we should pay more attention to. And I'm seeing more reports now because the West has made a turn in its own discourse, and I think they're now uncovering more limits to global China. Okay, let me stop here.